Hello, everyone. This is Sebastian, and I'm very excited to bring you all here today for another episode of Otomi. And this is my first episode since I started college, so I'm really excited to bring it to you all. And yeah, so this episode is going to be about it's going to be my final project for one of my classes, EMR 146. EMR stands for Ethnicity, Migration, and Rights. And in this class, we talked about the US Empire and migration, and we follow different migrant groups that came to the United States and ways in which they've been able to work in a system that has often been built to work against them. So the focus of my final project for this class and the final project I will present to you today is the Mexican-American War, which I thought is very important due to the way it's been portrayed in this country, like the importance of historical angles, and due to the way that it has impacted contemporary issues of migration and Mexican-American hate.
¿Qué onda? Soy Sebastián y bienvenidos a Otomi. In Otomi, we look at all aspects of Latin American society, from racial diversity to musical genres, to linguistic variations, to hybrid religions, to the history of minority communities. As a Hispanic American, I find it essential that we explore these topics. In Otomi, we discuss it all. Thanks for listening into this episode, and I hope you enjoy it.
So my education on the Mexican-American War began around fourth grade for me. But we would learn about Californian history, largely, which was made up of Mexican and Spanish residents in California. So one important part of that history that year was the first time that I was introduced to it, was the Mexican-American War, which to me was kind of challenging to grasp because it was the first time that I noticed that there was some sort of hostility between the two nations, like historic hostility, and how the United States basically was able to take away, by force, half of the country of Mexico, half of the Mexican state. So now I'd like to introduce another aspect to this anecdote, which was my grandfather, who I call him Tito, and every day after school, I would go to Tito's house. My grandma was there as well, but Tito would pick me up. He'd take me to his home. My grandma would cook us lunch usually, and that's where I would stay late into the evening doing homework. So when I would go there, it was like my second home. With my grandfather, we always talked about politics, about history, and I will admit I was extremely ignorant, obviously in fourth grade and at a young age, but my grandfather always gave me this sense of security and confidence in opining on certain topics, and that it was okay to be wrong. And I think that was very important in the discussion of history that we would have. And one of those was the Mexican-American War. That's how that ties into this. I was learning in fourth grade about the Mexican-American War from she was a great teacher, my fourth grade teacher. But she did have a twist or a certain angle to the Mexican-American War that was very different than the one that my grandfather had. My grandfather was educated in Mexico. He had a full ride scholarship to a military university where he was able to basically satisfy his intellectual cravings and to learn so much more about history. My grandfather loves history. So that's why when we talked about it, he said, that doesn't sound right. Because every time I'd come back from school, I would talk to my grandfather about what I had learned in class that day. And when I said I learned about the Mexican-American War and how Mexico gave the United States half of its territory after this war, my grandfather said, that doesn't sound right because you're making it sound like we voluntarily gave it to the United States. He always told me it's not really someone's not really giving you something voluntarily when when they signed a treaty. Because I remember I told my grandfather they signed a treaty giving away half of the country. So obviously the United States was owed that territory. You know, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. They were owed that territory. My grandfather said, when someone has a gun to your head and telling you to sign a piece of paper, you sign the piece of paper. Because if not, they kill you and they get someone else to sign it for you. So that's where he taught me that the historical context and the use, the perspective that you're learning from is very important. When I talked about Mexico-U.S. relations, just different perspectives, my grandfather said, clearly you're getting a very specific angle from your school. And you know what, like, we get certain angles as well, but the one that you're learning doesn't seem to be very objective, because the education that we were getting in school, in my California public school, was that the U.S. was basically righteously taking this land. It seemed that way, just from the way they were teaching us, that it glorified the Alamo, the Texan Revolution, even though there were many underlying aspects of these actions and historical events that are very important to know and that have greater implications. Now, this interaction is what brought me to the awareness of the issue of bias in historical records. The prominent dichotomy in our perspectives was highly reflective of the educational systems taught in two different nations that were once at war with each other. Now I'd like to dive into the meat of this episode and demonstrate how these historical events have manifested themselves into contemporary attitudes towards Mexicans. But first, we have to look into these historical events, the context behind them, what actually happened, and the results of those events. So, first, I want to talk about the importance of having accurate and impartial historical accounts. There's great importance in portraying historical occurrences in a truthful and honest manner, which I do believe the U.S. education, just as many education systems, is deprived of. The use of words and verbiage is essential to the way that people are taught. Now, I was always taught of the Lewis and Clark expedition as one of great adventure, completely positive intent. Great intent towards, the proliferation of the United States and its democratic, liberal values of freedom and just manifest destiny. And we've always been taught to have that connotation of manifest destiny as being good, as being a divine right, basically. And that's a big issue. So in one of the books that we read in this seminar, which I loved, was by Dunbar Ortiz, called Not a Nation of Immigrants: Settler Colonialism, White Supremacy, and a History of Erasure and Exclusion. Now, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz in this book does an amazing job of giving very accurate and accounts of just events that happened in ways that I never saw them. We've had students in class explain the process of unlearning that they've had in this class, relearning the things that they were taught as children, because the truth is that there are these perspectives that we are taught when we are younger that are very simplified, and we look deeper into what they are, into what these events really mean. There are underlying issues. So the example of the Lewis and Clark expedition in this book, Dunbar Ortiz explains it this way. In preparation for U.S. domination of the western half of North America, President Thomas Jefferson commissioned military spy missions into the newly acquired territory of the Louisiana Purchase. Military spy missions has never once been used by any instructor that I know to define any sort of manifest destiny action by the United States, like that hope, that goal to go towards the West. I thought it was extremely enlightening to have the opportunity to see this event be portrayed in such a way, this historical event to be portrayed as not something malicious, really, as a way for the European settlers of the East to infiltrate the indigenous communities of the West. We have to stop giving that Thanksgiving perspective of the Native Americans, the indigenous people, having no agency and having just been completely open to U.S. dominance, having just being there to be colonized, being objects of colonization, but in a manner that's extremely dehumanizing. It's essential that we speak with context of the U.S. empire, and in this sense, the Mexican-American War, to have that same vocabulary, not sugarcoating things, saying that is a military spy mission. Lewis and Clark were infiltrating these indigenous communities, learning their ways, and then taking advantage of their methods of survival, so that then Lewis and Clark could survive, make it all the way to the west, to the Pacific Ocean, and then return and allow for white settlers to invade the western United States. So the Mexican-American War was a tool utilized by the American government to capture half of Mexico's territory and complete U.S. expansion across the North American continent. It was not self-defense. As we will dive into it, there were implications of other things that drove this invasion of Mexico. First, we're going to talk about the context and the motives to the war. I'd say first and possibly most important is manifest destiny. That manifest destiny is what has driven the United States to its many stages of empire. After all, it's a call and a belief in divine right towards expansion to the West. And we've seen it manifested in many forms, but it started with the Louisiana Purchase, then acquiring California and all of Mexico, half of Mexico's territory, and then it continued from there, taking Alaska, taking Hawaii, and then further imperialism, taking Puerto Rico, taking the Philippines. All these regions that had some autonomy at one point, and the U.S. imposing its values in a way that really was just a colonial acquisition of the terrains. So we do need to know that manifest destiny lies in racism. It's based in racism. It's based in this belief of white people having a divine superiority to members of other races, and through this divine right, having the righteousness of conquering others. Another big motive for this Mexican-American War was the expansion of slavery. Even though to some that may be a surprise, if we look at the United States and its historical record, not exactly super surprising. This was one of the motivating factors of the Texan Revolution. It added a slave state to the Union. The reason why the war was triggered was because more and more white settlers were settling into Texas, as the United States government was really pushing for them to do. And then the reason why this Texan Revolution started was because Mexico had already banned slavery. It was banned with the presidency of Vicente Guerrero. And it had already been banned for years. So that's why Americans then that's that sense of self-righteousness. They said, you know what? No, we're not going to respect the ideals and principles of this nation, which were against and opposed to slavery. Instead, they said, no, we are going to take this territory as we believe it's rightfully ours. And that's where we see this sense of of United States superiority, in which a now more densely populated area of white people, which was Texas, was able to trigger a revolution and combat against Mexico, and largely for racist means. And a lot of people struggle to see the racism behind the Mexican-American War and the Texan Revolution. But the institution of slavery was a huge factor in driving white participation in these conflicts against Mexico. Harsha Walia was another author who discussed in her book Border and Rule of the Mexican-American border and the Mexican-American War. Now, there's one quote of Walia that I think summarizes the war and American motives amazingly well. So she says here, interrogating the formation of the U.S.-Mexico border exposes the moorings of the U.S. as a settler, slaveholding, expansionist, and exclusionary state. The southern border has been particularly pivotal in the ideology of manifest destiny. Frontier fascism was most forcefully enacted by President Andrew Jackson, whose bloody reign from 1829 to 1837 included massacring indigenous people and expanding slavery. So the magic of this quote, I think, is that it encapsulates many of the different issues that were occurring here during this war and the motives behind it. Here we have the genocide of indigenous people and the expansion of slavery. Also, it discusses the ideology of manifest destiny and the ideals of the U.S. as a settler, slaveholding, expansionist, and exclusionary state. And those are kind of all the big ideas behind what the U.S. was visualized and idealized into by white Americans, and was what white Americans used to justify their intervention in Mexico and in taking away large swaths of territory. Now, I'd like to analyze another quote by Willia, which I think was another great quote. Willia has amazing quotes on the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the Mexican-American War. In this one, she says, "The U.S. annexation of the Republic of Texas as a slave state in 1845 was followed by the full-blown U.S. military invasion of Mexico and debt manipulation by President James Polk, eventually resulting in the forced annexation of half of Mexico through the imposition of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. I mean, this quote is a great example, a perfect example of what I mentioned before, that whole Lewis and Clark dilemma. The idea of using words in an impartial manner, that just because it may make the United States look bad, it's necessary to say. And here we have the words U.S. military invasion of Mexico. Now, many people see this as, oh, this is the Mexican-American War. The U.S. had a right to go in because they were defending themselves or something of that sort. The reality was the U.S. was the aggressor. They perpetrated a lot of these crimes, of this war. The aggression behind it was largely fueled by the United States. And here we get that very good, very clear, very unbiased view of the war, where the U.S. is the invader. There's a military invasion by the U.S. of Mexico. In addition to the war, we get Willia talking about debt manipulation and forced annexation. These are words that never once did I come across in any of my history classes. And that's one of my fears, that we continue this portrayal of the United States, this story of a benevolent figure that never errs, that is always fixing the world, but never is in need of fixing itself. That is an issue, and that is American U.S. exceptionalism. And it is one of the big factors in what led to this war, Mexican-American War, the Guadalupe Hidalgo, Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which resulted in taking away half of the territory. And in today, anti-Mexican sentiment. It's because of that continued idea of American exceptionalism, U.S. American exceptionalism over Mexico. Now, to conclude on this segment on the war and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, I just want to emphasize that the way teachers taught me in elementary and middle school about this issue, and even in high school, was that basically Mexico voluntarily granted the United States half of its territory in order to repay for the war. Now, the idea there is that they make Mexico look like the perpetrators. Mexico look like those who are guilty, the war makers, and the reality is that that wasn't the case at all. There was heavy intent by Americans to engage in this war, and it's extremely important to understand that. So our next segment will be on the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which is basically the result of the war and how that impacted people. So of course this war was a conflict between the U.S. and Mexico regarding borders, regarding certain territorial disputes, and the United States ended up invading Mexico, going to the capital and forcing Mexico to sign a treaty that ceded half of its territory. So a very important thing to understand here is that half of Mexico is conquered by the U.S. Thus, a large population of Mexicans now became Americans. Although the territories that were taken by the United States were sparsely populated, and that's why when white Americans started moving in, it was easier for them to take control of the regions because they often overpopulated the Hispano population. It's important now to know that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo supposedly established certain rights for these Hispanos, these Mexicans that lived in these areas. But it really wasn't the case because in the end, they never became really American. The Anglo conquest led to a new racial hierarchy that wasn't existent in Latin America, not existent in Mexico. Basically, one of the readings that I did, a reader that we always read was Ngai, who writes a lot about issues of border patrol, immigration, often in Asian communities, but in this case also Mexico. And Guy, Ngai, I apologize if I struggle to pronounce that, but Guy describes this construction of a Mexican race as now with a white person perceived to be at the top of society, and not like a someone of Spanish descent, even though like someone of Iberian descent in Latin America may be seen as like at the top of the racial hierarchy. With the U.S. now invading, they were no longer there. It was like a white Protestant person of Western and North European descent was considered to be the top of the racial hierarchy. So in describing this construction of a Mexican race, Nye says, and I quote, illegal became constitutive of Mexican, referring not to citizens of Mexico, but to a wholly negative racial category, which comprised both Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans in the United States. Casting Mexicans as foreign distanced them from Anglo-Americans culturally and from the Southwest as a region. It stripped Mexicans of the claim of belonging they had as natives, even as conquered natives. And this is where we see that attempt by Anglo-Americans to racialize the Mexican identity. And not in a good way, but in a wholly negative way, as explained by Nye, saying that the word Mexican, which I find much pride in, Mexican derived from Mexica, another name for the Aztecs. It's a word with history. It's a word with meaning. It's a word with culture. And when people from the United States use it in a derogative manner, it's extremely offensive because the word has our culture, it has our ancestors, and that's why the word Mexican or Mexican unfortunately has strongly been used against people of Mexican descent. So now the next topic I'd like to talk about, which continues from this racializing Mexicans, is the indigenous struggle. So the majority, as I've said on this podcast before, the majority of Mexicans are mestizos. So they have ancestry mixed between Spaniards and indigenous people from Mesoamerica, from the American continents in general. And to another extent, there is also African ancestry added into there, but not to the same to the same degree as indigenous ancestry. An important part here is understanding that in the regions that were taken by the United States as a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, there was that new racial hierarchy, but it continued the discrimination of indigenous people. Now in Latin America, although a large portion of the people do possess indigenous blood, and in Mexico being one of the most mestizo countries in Latin America, there is an extreme racism. Even mestizo people are often extremely racist towards indigenous people. So there is this sense of colorism and a racial hierarchy in which, even if you're not fully white, the idea of having more whiteness is equated with the feeling of being superior. So there's this issue that occurred as a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo known as double colonization. So double colonization, as defined by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, is that double colonization refers to the Hispanos being descendants of the Spanish colonizers who appropriated most of the pueblo's territory, then themselves were colonized by the United States, thereby losing much of their land holdings, while pueblos experienced a new colonizer on top of the old Hispano one. So in this context, the Hispano is one who who lived in those territories, most in the north, I think, is the north of Mexico is the example here that they're giving. And Hispanos then became this, the Hispanos were these people who were predominantly of European Spanish descent. So this celebration, because they celebrated their Spanish heritage, not their indigenous one, not their Mexican one, but their Spanish heritage, was this worship and celebration of whiteness, and that is something where we saw that whiteness was coveted in Mexico, but then another level added with the colonization now of Americans, who put that Hispano ruling class of people of Spanish descent below them, now to a second tier. And as in any society, people want to elevate their social status, and they'll do what they can. And as we saw in this class, we saw how people from Southern and Eastern Europe, as well as people of Irish descent, were able to use their European heritage to basically whiten themselves. Because in Europe, they were often perceived to be inferior to people of North and West European descent. But coming to the United States, they were able to whiten themselves just in the way that they were compared to Black people and Latin Americans, Latinos. So the thing here now is to understand that the Hispanos utilized this heritage that they had to increase their social status. So Dunbar-Ortiz then quotes someone else, historian John M. Nieto Phillips, who was is a New Mexico Hispano, and he argues that the Spanish American identity of New Mexico Hispanos evolved out of a medieval rhetoric about blood purity, or limpieza de sangre, along with a desire to be accepted into United States white body politic. So as you see, that conclusion there is it's a mix of old medieval European ideas of blood purity, but it's added now to the context of a European of a white colonizer, a white colonizing body that is, in this case, the United States. And the United States body politic obviously favors white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So the Hispanos clearly saw themselves as disadvantaged and tried to enter the order. And this can be seen now in this next quote from Dunbar-Ortiz, which talks about the way in which rights for Mexicans were established. The 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had guaranteed to Mexicans who remained within the United States after the new border was established all the rights of citizens of the United States. Elite former Mexican citizens were able to enter the Anglo-social order, but many of those who were poor or owned little or no property, or who lived in socially segregated barrios, were sometimes classified by federal or state officials as Indian and denied white rights. So here we see how that indigenous ancestry is extremely prevalent within the way that the white American body the white United States body still perceived the indigenous people of Latin America, the indigenous people of, and especially even the mestizo people of Mexico. So you have people who are mestizo and who are denied rights because of their indigenous heritage. And there we see the idea of a lack of whiteness being something that people don't want because of the way that it hurts them socially. So I want to just emphasize the institutionalization of this racism against Mexicans. And I want to bring our attention back to a little earlier in this episode where I talked about President Andrew Jackson and President James Polk, who both were perpetrators of terrible crimes against indigenous people and against Black people. And the big thing is their opposition to Mexico. I find that this connection between the presidencies is important because it shows how over generations, over multiple terms, this hatred and distaste for certain people of color was extremely prevalent and hard to remove, to the point that it became somewhat ingrained within the American values of superiority and regarding Latin Americans and Mexicans as not equal. So now we're going to transition to our next, to our final and concluding section of this episode, which is the parallel of modern migration issues and fear mongering to that of which occurred during the Mexican-American War. So a big thing now that I'd like to remind us is that creation of a Mexican identity becoming a racial category. It's something that I think is very prevalent today with the now over, but the former presidency of Donald Trump, which resulted in a lot of anti-Mexican sentiment and resentment. And I think it's important to identify anti-Mexican sentiment specifically because there was a widespread use of the term Mexican, a very specific use of the word Mexican to the point where it almost criminalized Mexicans, to the point where the negative connotation was very strictly on the word Mexican, and to the case where there are places like Fox News demonstrating the perpetuation of anti-Mexican sentiment in American culture through the use of on Fox and Friends Weekend crew calling them Mexican countries, saying these Mexican countries. That's an extremely ignorant comment to make, and it shows how the association of Mexican with negative Latin America context is terrible, detrimental. But it's that idea of Mexico being the mecca of all of this crime or everything that's bad with Latin America. It's important to understand the way that Donald Trump used anti-Mexican and just in general racist rhetoric to get himself elected as president. He is an ethnic entrepreneur. He incited violence, incited hostility, animosity, aggression against Mexican people for the purpose of his win in the presidential election of 2016. So I'd like to bring us to the last chapter of Not a Nation of Immigrants by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, called The Border. And The Border is for me, it was one of my favorite chapters in the whole book. It talks about the contemporary border, but also the border in the 1900s. There is an emphasis on the anti-Mexican, anti-Central American campaigns that took place. One of the big ones is the Operation Wetback. And I learned so much from this section about the fact that this anti-Mexican, anti-Latin American, anti-Central American, anti-South American sentiment has existed for so long. So Operation Wetback was during Eisenhower's administration. And now it was run by a Mexican killing nationalist, Harlan B. Carter, who actually did kill a Mexican individual and was acquitted when he was young. But this is the interesting thing, how these individuals who have done terrible, terrible things are put into positions of power. Historically, these leaders have played this role in removing, at least in the issue of deportation, which in Dunbar Ortiz refers to it as the entertainment made of deporting Mexicans. Joseph M. Swing became the new Commissioner General of the INS, or Immigration and Naturalization Service. He saw undocumented Mexicans as an actual invasion of the United States. I see this highly hypocritical, considering that the United States literally did invade Mexico and take half of the territory. But again, the victors of history, which in that case was the United States, tend to write it in a way that favors them. The way that there's a sense of self-righteousness by the United States in deporting millions of people is something that doesn't sit well with me. And yeah, Operation Wetback led to the deportation of hundreds of thousands of people to Mexico, to separations of their families. It was terrible. Joseph M. Swing, boasted of deporting over 1 million undocumented immigrants. However, the real number was probably close to 300,000. But that shows you the glorification, the romanticization of deportation, and the idea that idea of deportation being entertaining. But regardless of the number, these immigrants were treated brutally. when they were detained, as many continue to be, as children are separated from their families, caged in inhumane conditions, and not allowed to see their family again in many cases. This has been a long episode, but I would like to conclude just saying that the Mexican-American War was an invasion of a young Mexico that resulted in the forced cession of half of its country. Racism and anti-Mexican sentiment largely fueled the rejection of the Mexican occupants of the region. They weren't made into Americans. They weren't accepted. Why? Because of their cultural and racial differences. Continued anti-Mexican sentiment has been perpetuated throughout American culture. That's obvious, especially with the rise of the ethnic entrepreneur Donald J. Trump to the presidency under populist, nationalist, white nationalist claims, and even reflected in the fear of immigration from other Latin American countries. People are just scared. People are scared of those quote unquote Mexican countries. Now, as we conclude this episode, I'd like to cite an Al Jazeera broadcast of an interview with Donald Rumsfeld, George W. Bush's Secretary of Defense. In this interview, which was broadcasted in February of 2003, Donald Rumsfeld was asked about the U.S.'s potential involvement in Iraq. And it was asked, would it worry you if you go by force into Iraq that this might create the impression that the United States is becoming an imperial colonial power? Now, Rumsfeld then replied to this question saying, I'm sure that some people would say that, but it can't be true because we're not a colonial power. We've never been a colonial power. That's just not what the United States does. We never have and never will. However, within a month, the United States invaded Iraq, and by April, it had established a new government in Iraq. So, the big thing here is that as long as we continue to deny U.S. complicity in empire building, we'll continue to repeat these same heinous acts of conquest. If we are unable to see that the United States has engaged in horrible invasions, interventions that have led to genocide, to millions of people dead, then it will continue to happen. Now, the United States has done great things for the world, and it most definitely has so much that it brings. But the United States needs to hold itself accountable. Just because people claim that the United States, or as they call it, America, has this exceptionalism, does not mean that it is excused from its heinous acts, which, with its great power, army, wealth, with all of that, the United States, with its liberalism, with its freedom, must be held accountable. And it takes politicians to acknowledge that the United States can make mistakes and that those mistakes do have huge consequences. And even if we are doing acts that we perceive to be out of benevolence, that does not justify us hurting, damaging, just ruining conditions in other countries. We cannot be reckless, and we must treat other people with dignity. People fleeing from countries of war, people fleeing from countries of poverty. And with this rise of Donald Trump, I will tell you, it was very terrifying to see that that segment of this nation's population is large and it's loud. I believe that today, as we see in this Donald Rumsfeld quote, we need to make changes. And we need to change our perspective and understand that the United States was a colonial power, continues to be a colonial power. People in Puerto Rico do not have voting rights. And when we look at these things impartially, if we say that the Lewis and Clark expedition was a military spy mission, if we say that the United States in the Mexican-American War was an invasion of Mexico, if we say that half of the Mexican territory was forcibly taken from Mexico, then we'll be able to see where we have erred and where we can correct our actions in the future. I hope you enjoyed this episode. It was just a pleasure making it. I really enjoyed it. This is a topic I'm so passionate about. I learned so much from EMR 146. It was a great seminar. Professor Taparat is amazing. I highly recommend that if you go to Harvard, or if you're planning on taking a course here, definitely join the EMR department, Ethnicity, Migration, and Rights. I highly recommend it. Great opportunities here. And yeah,